The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, in Northern California, where I've resided since my old Air Force days. I got out of the Air Force and decided to stay in California, and that was back in it was back a long time ago. We'll talk about that another time. As my listeners know, I get to talk to the most interesting people on the planet. Today is no exception. I was honored when Steven, I call him Steven. Should I call you Steven, or what should I call you?
I pretty much say anything, Ralph.
All right. Steven Godleaf. We'll start from there until I'm given permission for the diminutive. Steven, you have come to these airwaves a number of times, and we always enjoy each other's company talking ball. And we're going to enjoy each other's company, but what we're going to talk about is not necessarily an enjoyable subject. Vida Blue recently passed away. I did a podcast with Jerry Feidelberg honoring him the other day, and Steven called me and said, let's chat about Vida. I am so honored to receive a call like that from anyone, especially you. Thank you, Steven, for thinking about me and the podcast. Your thoughts on Vida?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Ralph. It's very kind of you. Well, what got me thinking about this was that I had reviewed a book for Bill James Online a few years ago, fantastic book called Dynamic, Bombastic, Fantastic, by a guy named Jason Turbo, who's a really terrific writer on baseball. And I came across some interesting stuff about Vida Blue that I hadn't known before. Although I was a fanatical follower of baseball during his heyday with the Oakland A's. And I mostly, I think, over my lifetime, I would say, devoted most of my attention to following the Mets. And one of the things that I personally noticed, because it was an odd juxtaposition, I reviewed two books, this book about the A's and another book about the Mets in the same article. And what occurred to me, I thought was just a kind of fantastical coincidence, that when you look at the careers of Vida Blue and Dwight Gooden, they form an almost eerie parallel in that both of them had almost the same exact career stats and had one fabulous year. There's a year that sticks out of both of their careers where they were just pitching at an unworldly level, and it occurred at a very early age. I think Gooden was 20, and Vida Blue was 21, and they were just simply far and away the best pitchers, not only in baseball, but in many, many years. For either of them, and the parallels just struck me as very close. And when I thought about it a little bit, I realized that nobody had ever noted that before. So I thought I would just start by bringing up this sort of confluence of almost miraculous seasons. And then when I looked at their career numbers, they're almost exactly the same. That's one thing that I just wanted to bring to your attention and your listeners' attention. But in the course of reviewing this book, I also came across a lot of very interesting details about Vida Blue's life that I guess many people don't know about, because I certainly didn't know about them at all.
Well, when you said that, the parallel between Gooden and Vida, first thing I thought about was that they both had a bit of a nose problem in their careers, in their personal life. And the second thing I thought about is that Mets fans are highly disappointed at the overall career of Dwight because of the potential that he showed. And Oakland fans and baseball fans think that Vida's career was tremendous. So that expectations have a lot to do with it. I wonder if the nose thing came up in your notes about this.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I drew not only the parallel of their otherworldly early season and the otherworldly similarity of their lifetime statistics, but also just in their lives in general, that both of them had trouble with cocaine, both of them had trouble with the law, both of them had trouble with their team owners, and the careers themselves had a very similar arc to them. Although it's interesting that you say that Oakland fans are pleased with Blue's career, whereas Met fans are overwhelmingly disappointed. But they also had interesting career arcs in that they were both players who, if you stopped their career sometime in their mid-20s, and you would have speculated on what their careers would have ended up at, they would have just each had spectacular numbers. And I would say from the age of 28, 27, something like that, both of them had spotty careers, I would say, had finished up their work with good seasons and bad seasons and seasons where they weren't around very much, but nothing like the expectation that
right. A key word right there, expectations, and what is put on a young player. The curse of an early start. I'm thinking of Fred Lynn, who had a great career, nothing like what would have been predicted in his rookie season. So I wonder how much the world, the baseball world, the fans, how much of an effect that has on a ball player throughout their careers, and how much pressure it bears, and how many great things you can say about those who bear up under the pressure. And so would you agree it's a head game primarily?
Well, there's certainly a psychological aspect to it, but, a lot of it has to do, I think, with both of them. And, we mostly want to talk about Vida Blue today, with the pressures of the way that they were treated by, in Blue's case, the owner of the Oakland A's. And the interesting thing that I found in reading this terrific book was the detail the author went into about the salary negotiations that went on after Blue had this, fantastic 24-win season, struck out over 300 batters, was just a dominating player, and he was being paid essentially for that year the little bit over the major league minimum, which I think was something like $14,000 at the time. And Blue had attempted to get paid something commensurate with what he was worth. And the owner, Charles O. Finley, just was having none of it. He absolutely refused. And this was the very final stages where owners could do that. They could take the position, you'll pay what I want, you'll accept what I want to pay you, because you don't have any influence over what your salary is. And this resulted in such a disputatious, unpleasant, nasty negotiating session that Blue missed a large part of the next season, had a losing record, and I think that, cast a shadow over his career that in some ways that he never really got over. I think it made him into a more difficult, more cynical, more disruptive player than he would have been at the age of 22. It was just a really rigorous few months that he went through that I found out a lot of details that I thought were very, very interesting about that off-season discussion.
Well, I remember that Finley threatened him to go to work for the plumbing company or the maintenance company that was sponsoring his retirement, so to speak. And it was an insulting thing to say. And to the idea, and I think it led to the end of the A's dynasty, where he started selling people off, allowing them to escape in free agency and what have you. It wasn't good for either side. Tough times for baseball.
Well, Finley was one of three owners. I think Bill James was the first person to point this out. One of three who were difficult in the same way, the other two being Ted Turner and George Steinbrenner. But neither of those two were actually crazy. I think they were both very stubborn, very difficult men. But again, from reading this book, it occurred to me that Finley was actually self-destructive and almost sociopathic in his not psychological need to humiliate people who worked for him. And that seemed to be the dominant theme of his dealings with Vida Blue, that the most important thing for him was not to win championships, although the A's had a lot of talent and they did win a lot of championships. But the important thing to Finley was that he had to emerge from any sort of conflict having humiliated the person he was dealing with. And as you go over Finley's career as the owner of the A's, you see this pattern repeating itself, where he literally would release a player or cause a player, in Catfish Hunter's case, to be released.
Right.
That made no sense at all. I mean, the episode with Ken Harrelson in the late 60s, where he simply cut him from the team, and the Red Sox signed Harrelson for $150,000 because they were paying Harrelson not only his salary, but they were also paying him for the signing rights. And Finley would do this repeatedly, and just essentially over what were relatively small sums, cost himself the services of really very talented, excellent ball players. And almost no owner would do that. I mean, I can't think of another owner who ever, cut a player in the prime of his career just because he was angry at him or because he had a dispute with the player.
Well, Finley had two things going against him. He always thought he was the smartest man in the room, whatever room he was in, and he didn't mind cutting his nose off to spite his face. Those are sociopathic tendencies that really reflect the man as he was. And I wanted to call attention to Carl Finley, who was a cousin of Charlie Finley, who basically ran the team and kept Charlie Finley from falling off the deep end. And Carl Finley was a terrific diplomat, a wonderful father to my frequent guest, Nancy Finley, who in her book describes the differences between the two. And so if anybody takes homage with the Finley name in any way, they can call me and I'll tell them about Carl Finley, who really is responsible for the good things that happened and keeping that dynasty together as long as it was kept together.
Yeah, real struggle, right? Because, Charles do these impetuous things. One of the things actually gets back to Vida Blue that I hadn't known about before I read this. You may know this anecdote because of your living in the area, but what had angered him so much about Vida Blue's negotiations was that Blue had engaged a lawyer to do the negotiating for him, which is only fair because Blue was a young guy, hadn't had more than a high school education, and he was up in negotiations against a very tough, experienced negotiator in Finley, so he had a lawyer. Now, this lawyer came to him because Blue had been sharing an apartment in Oakland with Tommy Davis, the ex-Dodger and former Met. Davis had recommended this lawyer, a guy named Gersh, to Vida Blue to negotiate, and this infuriated Finley. What Finley did while negotiations were going on, that spring training, was this is just another one of these episodes that just marks Finley's spitefulness. He cut Tommy Davis from the team. Again, it's purely out of a desire to get retribution for Davis recommending this lawyer. Davis was coming off a year where he had just batted .324 for the Oakland A's. He was a fourth outfielder, backup first baseman, and a pinch hitter. And he had a terrific year. But Finley just cut him, and he cut him in the most selfish and nasty way that he could have. He instructed the manager, Dick Williams, to take Davis on a road trip in spring training, and when they got to the destination, to tell Davis that he was cut from the team and he would have to get back to the wherever they trained. I forget where it was. He'd have to get back on his own, and he would have to negotiate whatever he was going to negotiate with another team. So Davis was just devastated, and he couldn't figure it out. He made a very interesting remark. He said, if a guy hits 324 for you, and he commits murder and is sent to the penitentiary, you get him out of the penitentiary. In other words, Davis was saying, I'm a really valuable player on this team, and not only did he try to humiliate me by cutting me in this way, but he also hurt himself because now I'm free to negotiate with another team, and that's exactly what Davis did. The DH was instituted the next season, and he had several excellent seasons with the Baltimore Orioles as their DH, and Finley had to go out and hire lesser ball players to serve as his DH. It just didn't do the A's any good at all, and the only reason he did it was because he was angry at Davis for recommending the lawyer to represent Vida Blue in his salary negotiations.
And to leave a black player at large in a small city in the South to get back to civilization, so to speak, is criminal in itself.
There was a lot of racism attached to Finley's behavior. I think that, I wrote in my review that he was a non-discriminatory sociopath, and that he would display anger at white players and black players alike. But the black players seemed to be singled out for this kind of treatment from Finley, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that.
But in fairness to the majority of the owners, St. Louis, the Cardinals, St. Petersburg, blacks couldn't sit with white players. They couldn't go to the pool. They had, in many cases, get boarding houses to take them in those days. They were tough days for America, and yes, Finley displayed many racist things, but like you say, non-discriminatory. Mike Andrews comes to mind. So baseball lived through the Finley days. Let me give a little credit to Finley, too. He built that dynasty, last true dynasty in baseball, 72 to 74. They won 3 consecutive world champions. And Finley helped build that. He had connections to scouts and what have you, to discovered a lot of people. So life was a mixed bag around Charlie Finley, for sure.
Well, you can't argue with his results, but when you look at all of the players who he lost just through his own peak, and very often he would be so erratic. There was actually another book that I reviewed was a book. I don't know if you remember this guy playing for the. I don't know if he ever played for Oakland. I think he was gone by the time the A's left Kansas City. A pitcher named Skip Lockwood.
Skip Lockwood has been a contributing guest on Comfortably Zoned for a long time. Great book. His wife wrote a book about baseball as well. Skip is tremendous. Let him tell you or read the story about the one time Skip Lockwood lost his ride to Shea Stadium the day Seaver was traded. So
that takes a lot of room in his book. He writes about his Met years, and I remember him very well when he pitched for the Mets. But the story about Finley with him, I don't know if he ever told us. He probably did, because you're situated in the Bay Area. But did he ever tell the story about getting the better of Finley, negotiating his bonus contract as an 18-year-old infielder?
No, but I remember he was mentored by the Glider at that time, who was an ace infielder. And yes, I do vaguely remember the story. And he spoke very highly of Finley because Finley got him, for some reason, you tell the story, but they got along well.
Well, the reason and inexplicably well, the thing that Lockwood tells that's very uncharacteristic, because you have to remember, this is in a context of a man who literally just dissociated himself from people like Ken Harrelson and Catfish Hunter and Tommy Davis and many other excellent ball players. Lockwood was a kind of, I guess, a hot shot as an 18-year-old prospect, and he was wooed by a number of big league teams. One of them was Finley's A's, and Finley's scout came to Lockwood's house and presented him with a contract for $35,000, which was pretty good pay in
those days, for sure.
And Lockwood, who I guess thought very highly of himself, looked at the contract, pulled out a pen, and wrote a 1 in before the $35,000 number, and he said, "This is what I'll sign for." And the scout said, "Well, Mr. Finley will never go for that. You're a very lucky boy to be getting this $35,000. He'll never pay you $135,000." And Lockwood said, "Get him on the phone." So the scout got Charles Finley on the phone, and amazingly, Skip Lockwood talked Charlie Finley into agreeing to the $135,000, which was a phenomenal sum. I think it was just about almost exactly the sum that Sandy Koufax was able to negotiate for his salary in his final year with the Dodgers, which is to say the best pitcher in baseball would get a contract worth about $135,000. And this kid who had zero professional experience managed to get Finley to sign that contract. And I thought, that $100,000 that Skip Lockwood got out of Charlie Finley, that would have paid for Catfish Hunter's entire contract dispute that he was having with Finley 10 years later. So this business of Finley deciding not to pay his players relatively small sums is counterbalanced by his throwing this around, that amount of money around on a whim. And in fact, I think anybody, even probably Skip Lockwood, would say he was not exactly worth that kind of world-shattering figure.
Right. Exactly.
Overall, looking at his entire career. So, in other words, Finley would do these things in a way that was absolutely just mercurial. He would just do it on the thinnest of rationales, and he would make these decisions. And I think that that there's an awful lot of luck that I associate with the A's dynasty because of that, because he certainly was not using his seichel to.
That means brains for those of you without seichel, or that could happen. Go ahead, Steven. That was great. Did I lose you?
No, I'm
Steven.
still here.
Oh, okay.
You wanted me to translate the Yiddish for you, or?
No. Seichel is brains, and That's good enough. Let me tell you something else about Charlie Finley. Charlie Finley developed tuberculosis and had to be in a sanitarium for over a year. While he was there, he had been in the insurance business. While he was there, he literally invented disability insurance for doctors. And that's how he made his first $1 million, and then more. That's how he got the financing for all of this. He was clever enough to see, he sat there and befriended doctors and realized that if they became disabled, they would lose everything. And so Charlie Finley is very famous in the annals of insurance for putting together the first group disability thing. So if you were a member of the Doctors Association or whatever, you could buy disability insurance that would, in the event you became disabled or partially disabled, a surgeon, for instance, losing the use of his or her hands, insurance companies would make up for that. And so he was a dichotomy, very eclectic, hard to buttonhole. Charlie Finley was.
Funny thing about him, and I'm referring to him being a lucky owner and a very unlucky person at the same time, because God knows that if he'd just made rational decisions, he might have been able to extend that dynasty for many, many years beyond what he did. But one of the interesting things about Finley's career, I think, is just the way he became a team owner in the first place, which is that when Connie Mack decided he would sell the Philadelphia A's, a Chicago millionaire bought the team. And that Chicago millionaire was not Charles Finley. But it was a guy named Arnold Johnson who was in his 40s and had made a fortune, and he bought the team from Connie Mack. But Arnold Johnson, even though he was a relatively young man, he bought the team, as I said, when he was still in his 40s. He died suddenly in, I think, maybe the spring of 1960 or so. And the fact that Johnson died enabled Finley to put in another bid for the team, and that's how he came to own the team. But it seems to me that it was very likely that Arnold Johnson could have lived easily another 10 or 20 or 30 years, and Finley would never have gotten a shot at owning the Athletics franchise. So a lot of what happened to Finley in terms of him being an owner in the first place and in running the Oakland A's seems to me just to be in the right place at the right time and making the most of that.
Yes, but also he had the foresight not to be a Yankee farm club anymore. And that turned baseball around from the 60s on. If you remember, Kansas City at the time under Arnold Johnson was literally supplying the Yankees with the likes of Roger Maris, for instance, and pitchers, Art Ditmar, Ralph Terry, even Bobby Shantz, who was an original Philadelphia A, not an original Philadelphia A, but he went on to Kansas City and later became a New York Yankee. as did his brother, Wilbur Chance, a catcher. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Chance because, he also, like Vida Blue, like Dwight Gooden, had this one fantastic year where he won 24 games and was a superstar for exactly 1 year, but never approached those heights again. I think, if you probably isolated the, best years of a pitcher in the last 70 years or so, I think you'd have to include Chance and Gooden and Vida Blue and Sandy Koufax and
Fidrich.
Sorry?
Fidrich. Mark Fidrich.
Fidrich, I don't know if he would fit into quite that category, but yeah, Fidrich certainly had that one very good year. I think you'd have to include Guidry in there. Had that one fantastic year for the Yankees where he basically just couldn't lose. And as I'm saying, it's very few pitchers who were able to put together that sort of super season. But these guys that we're talking about today are, among that very select group.
Right. Baseball is a great game. Just our conversation, one thing leads to another. And let's do this more often. And I really appreciate your time on the radio.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Ralph. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
All right. Steven Godleaf is the guest. I'm Ralph Tyko, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And we kibitz, speaking of Yiddish. Thanks, Steven. Have a great day.
You too, Ralph.
And thanks for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Everything we've ever done is archived on the Comfortably Zoned channel on YouTube. And enjoy. Happy trails and adios.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.